It was another Monday morning. The sign on the door said private investigator, but the sign below that said closed, and I was saying yes to a third cup of coffee. It was hot, but left a bad aftertaste, like a vendor pitching AI to solve secure code. My partner was out of town looking into a criminal trespass, but that case was like a bad API, all swagger and no authorization, when there was a knock at the door. "You've got some debts to pay," grumbled a bulky silhouette, "and I know you're in there." I looked at the door. The sign was still turned to closed, and the bolt was still turned to locked. I knew secure by default when I saw it. They knocked again. "Last warning," they said, long on vowels but short on patience. And then, before I could respond, a crowbar came through the door's glass panel, held by a fist that looked ready for a conversation of its own. And that's how I learned about Secure by Design. Which means this week we switch our interview segment to the second half with some pre-recorded sessions from Black Hat. In the news segment, Discord.io gets a TKO, Azure AD gets a CSRB, ML models get confused, the long history of how XSS gets abused, and more. Find an exit and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Developers have a need for speed to meet market demands, and application security needs to ensure that data and privacy constraints are met. Unfortunately, that can slow down delivery. So, is it even possible to deliver secure software quickly? Enter Secure Coding, brought to you by GuidePoint Security's Application Security Services. Secure coding is more than a process, it's a cultural shift, one that will make it possible for both developers and AppSec to build in security while applications are being developed. Visit our AppSec resource hub to learn more at securityweekly.com/guidepoint.
This is episode 252, recorded August 21st, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, I'm starting to enjoy not just your intros, but also your wardrobe changes.
It's the magic of video podcasting for those of you just listening to our audio feed. Those of you who are listening or watching, we do have an announcement for you. You can join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. That's a lot of S's. This series of one-day invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We're offering $100 off admission when you register with code SECWEEK23. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. And that, John, because we're starting off with the news, I've actually got some good news and some bad news. What would you like to hear first?
It's a Monday. Hit me with the bad news.
All right. The bad news is that we are stopping all operations for this foreseeable future. The good news is that is from Discord.io and not us. So we'll continue to be podcasting. But yes, Discord.io has... Not April Fools. But this is quite a new take on the we take security seriously. They suffered a breach and they said we're done. And there's sadly there's nothing more, no more details on the how the breach happened, because we'd really love to know what the scope of the breach was and just how bad it was. But this is the Discord.io is, I think, they say the impact of it was, as they say, non-sensitive information. This is your user ID, your avatar status. There's a handful of accounts that may have had sensitive information like your username, which can be different from what you display on various areas, as well as your billing address. And what was a little bit surprising, your salted and hashed password from everyone before 2018 that was using Discord as the login method. But it was pretty interesting that this service is down. I believe this is just what's handles the link shortening and redirects the images. So everyone is still talking about Discord, but wow, that's quite the response.
Yeah, I didn't even realize they had payment information. It was only on my radar from the point of I heard it was used for invites to channels and things like that, or to servers. Yeah, it's. I mean, it makes sense in a way, right? I mean, not so much it makes sense, but compared to having Discord.com have an issue, we're so used to seeing this pattern of, well, do I want to say I prefer? I'll say I prefer. I prefer to see a pattern where it's the sort of the edge systems, so that are having a little less security than the actual core thing. And that's sort of what happened in this case, right? So for those who don't know, Discord.io is not Discord.com. So Discord is still up and running. That is not closed and gone anywhere. It's the ancillary services, I will say. Because I had quite a few folks over the last few days go like, oh my God, Discord's down. They got hacked. It's like, no, little part of it. But yeah, it's unfortunate still. Hopefully over time we will get a little more information. If they're having this type of a response up front, I mean, I guess that's sort of it's a good sign in that both that they're just cutting it off at the knees, but also that will maybe get some more information once they maybe understand themselves what just happened. So good luck to those folks.
Indeed. And it does sound like ideally, potentially, that's going to be an educational postmortem from an engineering perspective, in the sense of we had to burn everything down and rebuild from scratch because the hack was that bad. But John, you mentioned you would prefer to see, these edge systems. So probably you don't prefer to see something like Azure AD be the source of a compromise and used to go all over the place. And this is what happened with Microsoft's Azure. And the CSRB is looking into it. So this is the Cyber Safety Review Board. So I don't really have much more to add to that other than we'll be watching for this report when it does come out. I
don't think I have much to add either. I mean, I've been watching this and just not talking about it. I think folks know my thoughts in general. When you have congressmen talking about the state of your security, maybe not the best place to be. And I hope things get better. I know they've got good folks, and unfortunately, here we are. And I'll leave it at that. I'm tired of bitching and whining about this.
Here we are. I think the one thing I did want to add, though, I did as a reminder, there was sponsored by Wiz, but with some other cloud security vendors, got together to talk about the Cloud Vuln DB project. And this project was because there's not really CVEs for cloud service providers. And, AWS was the one that started about the shared responsibility, and other people have called that a shared fate, or important areas, or different ways of, framing how the CSP and the tenants are supposed to be handling security. So I did want to throw that in there just as put some links to the show notes for reminders to folks who want to dive into those.
Now you will catch my attention. Well, you always have my attention, but I'll bite on that. From 2 points of view, right? So one, that whole separation. What's the phrase again they use?
Shared responsibility, or
are
we over that?
No, it's not. We're over that. I mean, I think it's super valid and valuable, but every time I hear someone use it, I just feel like my eyes roll a little bit. It's like I think it almost started a little bit as I don't know this, but it feels like it started as a marketing phrase. I remember, when I was dumb enough to be trying to run a secure cloud system against Amazon, and I'd go to investors and stuff, and I'd say, Amazon's not secure, right? They're securing their stuff. They're not in business to secure your stuff. That really shocked people. But I think even now, people going to the cloud, it's needed to say that there's a shared responsibility. I completely get that. But it's it feels like the reason we're in that situation is because people are walking into this without really looking at what they're walking into. I was interviewing someone, I don't think it's on here, I think I was at ASW recently, where I'm like, do people understand, or do they need to actually have some level of, how do we get them to realize that when you go into cloud, there's a completely different, you have to know what you're doing, right? You can't just go in there and turn things on and we've saved money or spent money. And on the second thing, the Cloud CV, or Cloud Vuln database, where this is interesting to me in this particular case, I'm trying to figure out how, leave the vendor out of it. How common do vulnerabilities have to become? How bad do things have to get? How does someone have to know that there's shared responsibility, the other half, the partner you're sharing with, they're not doing the best job. How far does that have to go before a CIO or a VP of Eng or whoever's signing that check says maybe we shouldn't be using that provider, or a U.S. government? And the reason I'm bringing it back to this is like, okay, if we've got this database of vulnerabilities, part of the reasons we have CVEs, or we'll stay with CVEs, is so we're able to both document and track and talk about something in a shared way, right? CVE 2019-53, blah, blah, blah. I was actually looking at that one again. But anyways, shut up, John. But so, do you see where I'm going with this? It's like, okay, well, that's why we have that. So we came up with a vuln database for cloud stuff, so we have some sense of what's going on over there. Still super young, not super young, but it's probably not getting a ton of visibility yet. But like at some point, is that going to have enough of a presence that people will realize we don't use Cold Fusion or some of these other really horrible things out there? Will that have an effect on how people pick a cloud provider? And that's what's sort of the interesting part about this to me. Maybe at some point we realize that certain services at a provider aren't that great, or I'm curious to see where it goes. Right now, it's I'm just sort of watching, going, oh, yeah.
Now, in part of that curiosity too, or part of the motivation for the Cloud Vulns DB was to say, sometimes the cloud service providers, they'll have some issue, but they'll fix it, and they'll fix it for tenants as well. So it's silently behind the scenes. Other times, they may fix it from this point going forward, so from an August 24th, first going forward, but existing instances didn't get that patch,
and that's the shared
still have that problem, and that's that clarity. That's
responsibility to fix your problem. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So, however, so you've been looking at some very different perspectives here too, John. So, you had a really neat one on the. So here's another phrase that gets a little overused, perhaps, and kind of empty as it gets cliched. Where our security team isn't the department of no, but it takes some effort to not be no. But you got a fun take on this.
Yeah. So this is based off of, and it's funny even. I tend to be, in this particular case, I tend to be very department of I don't want to say no, but extremely paranoid is the phrase I'll use. So even like when the Security Weekly team was getting ready to head down to Black Hat, one of the guys, it was their first time, and they're like, do I turn my phone off? And like I suggested a Faraday bag, which I think they got. But like, I'm very, in that particular case, here's where it's coming from. Me versus a civilian phrase I've been using recently. If I go into a security conference and I get hacked, that's not good, right? The security guy, the guy on the podcast shouldn't be getting hacked at the podcast or at the security conference. So I'm going to go really try to, make myself as little a target as possible. On the other side, a civilian walking through the show, what would they want to do to be relatively secure? I'm not going to, I've said to some folks in the past, like, don't bring your laptop, or don't leave in your hotel room, or don't do this, blah, blah, blah. The point I'm getting to, there's an article I posted here from, of all things, very non-security focused website, 9to5Mac. They cover Macintosh and Apple rumors about, whatever's coming out next and blah, blah. But, so the headline sort of sums it up pretty nice. If the choice is Fort Knox security or AirPods, I know which one I'm choosing. And one of the things which happened at Black Hat this time, for we haven't covered it, probably should. Some folks had a little device in their backpack, which was emitting. They figured out how to spoof what comes off an Apple TV, the Bluetooth LE. So if you're in a conference room with one and you unlock your phone, it says, "Hey, do you want to display on the TV, the conference mode stuff?" Conference room mode stuff. So they were walking around the conference floor at Black Hat, and like people would have something on their phone that would get like this thing like, "Do you want to display on a TV?" What? I don't want to display on a TV. It's like, so it was not a vulnerability per se, but it's a way of screwing with people, right? And sort of going, "Hey, are you as secure as you think you are?" And his point is like, okay, well, you'd have to be dumb to, once you see that, to actually click on it and accept or start broadcasting on some TV. So you just ignore the stupid thing or say cancel, go away, right? But at the same time, to me, it's like, okay, well, but you're showing something on my phone. It's like, okay, well, hopefully things are going to work right and cancel out, not actually. But if someone's goodness, is there a weakness in there or something going on? So it's, again, a little bit of paranoid on my part. But his case, as he said, is like, I want to still listen to, music or phone calls on my AirPods. So I'm not going to turn that thing off. So I brought it up here from that point of view of, we talk about security and we don't want to be Department of No, but at the same time, we're trying to figure out how do we either get developers to be to work with us or to get applications more secure or management or things like that we talk about. But this is what the guys on the other side of that fence are thinking about. So just keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind. I think I want to tie that to some research out of JAMF talking about also iPhones and iOS and a little bit of what's the risk, because there is, and as I put in the show notes, this article's, it's some fun research. It's really neat. They take a good deep dive into it. They talk about hooking functions. So from that technical aspect, if you like doing this type of work, check it out. But they also point out that this technique, well, one, has been observed in the wild, and it requires a jailbroken device. So sort of I'm setting this up in that idea of we don't want to cover these, or when we talk to developers, we can also say, the risk of this may be low for this reason, or our CVSS score isn't 10 because here is the environmental impact, the temporal impact, for example. But this one, to try and summarize real quick, is that the researchers found out a way to make the UI represent that the phone is in airplane mode, but on the back end, the system, Safari, for example, has not gone into airplane mode. And they say this is for the premise that a user, we've got John Kinsella who's walking around, sees his phone in airplane mode, and he feels a bit safer because the phone isn't talking to anybody, when in fact, I've got to somehow convince him to click on a link, and his phone is now siphoning off all types of fun things from Safari. Who knows what that might be? Reading
cat memes,
reading about cold fusion, all that exciting stuff. But the point here is really just that distinction of like the UI and how users might be fooled about what their phone is doing. And one of the reasons that I'm just kind of neutral or tepid, or choose your word there on the risk of it, is this felt like clickjacking a little bit too. Clickjacking was huge within the web space. Lots of people were showing, here's how I could clickjack this site, this other site, these UI redress types of attacks. But as we've seen, I think in exploits and in breaches, cross-site scripting works, or even just compromised username and passwords. There's a lot of the dead simple types of vulns that are the ones that they leverage, rather than the types of bug bounty vulnerabilities that this might fall into.
It's interesting to think about from a point of view not clickjacking, the jailbroken phone, or any jailbroken device. How does that play into a threat model? Right. Usually we're thinking about device X in a certain state, but like once you start doing something like that and getting around that security, which is within relatively easy to do, right? Suddenly you're changing a lot of that. Second thought there, is you mentioned clickjacking, is how it'd be interesting to see, probably easier it'd be really easy. I'm thinking about a use case from a Apple TV, but I'm sure it's going to happen on phones too. How do you know that you're actually back at your home screen? So there's one of the streaming TV apps that we have now. I counted last night. I had to click on the home button, the menu button, whatever the main thing is on the Apple TV remote, 6 times to get back to the home screen. Okay, so what if 3 times in there, 4 times in, someone just displayed a home screen or something looked like it, maybe at the absent default location? They probably could have got me to go and do something different, right? So I'm sure there's still some further tampering or further fun for folks to have in that space.
Further fun for folks. Let's see what what people bring up as their favorite type of this may be the type of thing that phishing turns into, or getting away from inspecting links into more of UI redress or fun stuff like that. But you also had another article, John, that was talking about maybe things that are still common or that aren't going away. And as I mentioned, like clickjacking, it still isn't quite going away. You've got hard-coded credentials though, and people are still putting those into GitHub. Is this really the case, or are these just I'm losing it here because a little bit of frustration, I suppose.
This is the frustration episode. I'll take hard-coded credentials and GitHub commits for 200 Alex. Yeah. So this was a pair of talks. This is based off a pair of talks at Black Hat this year from a vendor, in full disclosure, who they've got a solution for this basically, right? So okay, well, cool. But anyway, so it sounds like the stats sound decent behind it, or the research. They scanned for the last year. It sounds like they've been doing it for a few years. All the commits coming off of GitHub are coming into GitHub from public repos. So in the last year, 2022, 2023, for folks listening to this in 10 years' time, that means they scanned 1 billion commits, 1 billion plus commits. Out of those 1 billion plus commits, they found 10 million secrets being committed, which is somewhere between 50 to 60% more than what they saw in the previous year. So, yeah, it's there. It's getting worse. It sounds like, I mean, they're saying one of the reasons is because people aren't using software to check for secrets before they come in. Great, thanks. Figure that out. But really, it's how do you? It's breaking my brain too, Mike. It's not just you. As we know this, we've started seeing this. I think it just shows once again, we will be here in 5 years still talking about application security because we're not quite solving it there yet, and we can't get the passwords out of the hard coded.
And in the article you cite, it talks a little bit. It talks about like the hard coded credentials. It talks about a little bit of the consequences of that. But it's more than just the hard coded credentials of the mobile apps or the API keys. And it talks about like S3 buckets. So, and I'm using this to tie it back to that shared responsibility, or that cloud service provider angles too, as much of how much did AWS, or pick your GCP or Azure corollary, how much did they say, here's your S3 bucket, go store all of your check images in there or whatever sensitive info, and just don't mess up. I think was Josh Goldberg's AppSec in 3 words comment a while ago, rather than having them say, here is, S3 buckets or these storage are default blocked from internet access, or that idea of default secure is where I'm trying to go with that. And this touches a little bit on that, as much as it touches on why are we still using hard-coded credentials, or credentials maybe that are long-lived tokens rather than more ephemeral tokens that are easier to do within cloud-to-cloud service environments versus a mobile device to cloud, perhaps.
I mean, I guess, and it's partially, it's not quite secure by default. It is what's the phrase I'm looking for? Sort of like framework by default. So in other words, if you think about some of the modern either frameworks or languages out there now, either if you're setting up a REST app, or setting up like a React application, say with create React app. I think that's not the latest and greatest that the kids use. But anyways, these things usually they set up the scaffolding for you. I think React actually does. I think about it, but for our TypeScript does too. My argument's falling apart. My argument here was going to be, hey, wouldn't it be cool if when those scaffolding is happening, it actually creates here's how to read from a config, so you don't hard code these things. But I think TypeScript does it. I'm not sure if React. Not sure. I don't think Rust does. But that should. If that was there, if there's one less thing for a developer to set up, okay, where's the library I have to find to read configs and blah 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 blah, that type of thing. If it's just there by default, would they use it more? That's what I'm hoping. And then maybe you wouldn't have these props until they check in their config files. So I don't know. Maybe we need to get the guys to modify Git by default to check for these things.
Yeah. And, GitHub has been doing, they have their own scanners for tokens. Then they will have connections with AWS, for example. They'll actually just automatically revoke a token if they see that in there. So there are some nice movements forward in this space. But John, you also, the cloud seems to be on your mind. You've got another article from a SaaS company that had an unexpected cloud outage with a kind of fun/funny consequence.
Yes, 3D printing is on my mind. Is what it is. So I get a lot of this in my news feed. But in this case, a company called Bamboo, but it's spelled BAMBU. They make a series of 3D printers that compete with some of the bigger. To me, it's a smaller name. They compete against some of the big ones out there. But anyways, they've got respectable printers and a related cloud service, because everything has to be in the cloud nowadays. And why they're doing it is they're trying to make ease of use, right? So the printer sits in the garage or somewhere where it's not on your desk and making noise and bugging you all the time. when you want to print something, you go and drag and drop it to your favorite browser, whatever have you, and say, print this thing. And the printer pulls within 30 seconds or a minute, and off it goes crunchy, crunchy, and you've got a thing. Cool. Except it turns out they didn't really QA this one very well. So when the SAS went down, don't think it was maintenance. I think it actually had an outage. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning. They're saying 12 o'clock UTC. So do your time zone math wherever you are, people. The result of that was the printers, when they'd go and do their polling for new objects, would time out. That happens. Okay, things go down. That's not that big of a problem for, it's not mission critical or life critical. The problem is when the printer timed out on its connection, the logic somehow decided to just start printing the last thing that it printed before. So everyone's printers woke up in the middle of the night or whatever time it was, and they suddenly started hearing from the other room, ear, as this thing started doing its thing. And that's my impression for today. But yeah, so, the reason I posted here is beside being a physical thing or something different to think about is, testing. And I think we're talking about that in a few different ways, like either, so that's, again, people keep it on your mind, or how do you, if you create something like this, we're talking about threat modeling, we're talking about some of these different things. How do you test, not so much like horrible, like, oh, someone's going to break into me or hack me or something like that. It can be something very basic like this. It's still worth trying to prevent that from happening in your application.
And maybe there's a little bit of that chaos engineering or security chaos engineering that can go into this, and just to say, let's start unplugging things and start seeing what happens in these strange failure modes where our cloud goes out, things that you might not particularly expect, or it could just be one particular service within the cloud too that was pretty critical to that printer. So absolutely fun. There's I'm going to take us back to AI and ML. So try and bear with me, John. Partially I'm doing this because next week we're going to have a fun interview about AI and ML topics. But they have an article here from, actually there was a write-up from DEF CON presentation. And as an aside, last week we also talked with Josh Goldberg about giving presentations. And one of the things that you talked about too was, what's the lifetime of the slides? How do you make the slides live after you give the presentation? And Josh himself had also said he had written a Medium post and then kind of presented it, and that didn't go well for many reasons. So listeners, go check out the reason why. This is sort of the inverse of that, where the presenter had some slides, gave the talk, and then very nicely wrote up a blog post about it. So this is a nice way for those of us who didn't make it to DEF CON get to consume it. But what they're talking about is they introduce some model confusion, sort of like a dependency confusion, but for ML models, an org confusion, which is not unique to the AI ML space. It's sort of like domain squatting, if you will. We saw this with Heroku, and you can see it in GitHub even for that matter, or just domain squatting in AWS. Also some typo squatting, other things like that. It's familiar. So I guess where I'm going with this is maybe let's extend that 5-year job security of AppSec that you mentioned to maybe 10, 15, a little bit longer than that. So we got a lot more episodes to cover here. And then, of course, he does mention good old social engineering at the end. But I thought this was, so those were some of the reasons I liked this, because it wasn't just like, here's a fun prompt injection that I found. It was more of, here are different things about the ecosystem, and they focused on Hugging Face, which we've mentioned before. But I also like that they didn't just say, this is probably what could have happened, or this, or I mean, I'm just going to make some conjectures and come up with some threat models. They actually followed through on these threat models. And in some case, like poisoning a model, the execution was actually a lot easier than they even expected. So it was nice to see actual, effort put into demonstrating a lot of these problems.
Yeah. So back a few minutes on that topic I was talking about earlier about, scaffolding for our languages or frameworks to make sure that they have some things for the basics. Maybe we could also go and have some of the frameworks for spinning up SASs to cover some of these basics too. I mean, it feels like, I know I shouldn't be sighing, but there's a pattern here, right? It's like someone comes up with a new thing, like what was, I I got I got a Turing Pi, the Pi cluster thingy. So on the board that you plug CM4s into are different sort of small little things. And you get like a cluster of Pis or NVIDIA GPUs. The admin interface on it, this is not a security, not breaking release. There's no authentication. So you can turn off the damn things, but like, okay, and I get it. They're going as hard as they can, and I'm not picking fun of them. It's a cool little product. These guys are going as fast as they can. They did a Kickstarter, they got some cash and everything else, but like always basics, they're going to have to go and figure out, okay, now I got to do authentication on this stupid thing. That's something else for me to do and keep track of and blah, 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 blah. And I know that's a really low hanging fruit because that exists out there, like, authentication for a web service, but at the same time, you get the point. Yeah, I thought the interesting parts to me on this were actually what I'm talking about. Like, yeah, I hadn't thought of doing typo squatting at Hugging Face, but totally makes sense. And the thing is, that just doesn't go for the Hugging Face is one of probably 10 of these different model repos. So if for folks, they already got Netflix on Hugging Face, go get it on someone else's site. Yeah, I was joking off air. How long are we going to have to put up with this machine learning thing before it goes away? And obviously, it's not going to. But the maturity level of this is like what we saw with crypto in some ways, and I think that's what makes it exciting and cool and great, and give us all a chance to work on it or do interesting things with it. But the low hanging fruit parts would be nice if they just sort of snap my finger and they got fixed.
Yeah, maybe we do need an AI to do some secure code for that, or secure SaaS. On that note, as a real quick aside too, I included a relatively long article from Stephen Wolfram that goes into, I think it's very approachable, that describes basically the math and the approach of LLMs, neural nets, etc., so that you can understand, and honestly, so that I can understand. When I say, the LLMs like ChatGPT, essentially a glorified probability model of saying what word comes after this word. And let's start to string together a couple words and a couple sentences. So quite a long read, but I think quite informative and really helpful for just understanding the technology behind a lot of these models.
I'm going to add one more into our show notes after this report goes live. There's something I found last week, which is super entertaining. It's a little YouTube video of this guy. It looks like he's done a few, where this one in particular, he's training it's ML, it's not even the newer stuff, but he's training it on how to get a physics object to learn how to bowl. And it's just like, it's cartoon quality, and like, it's fairly hilarious, like how bad the thing is, and how it actually just like by luck happens to get the ball down the alley. But it'll give folks also another chance of both to think about yourself as well as to share with like management and others. I think it's really interesting. I'm starting to see more and more people think about or talk about how does this math work, right? Instead of, ooh, magic, ChatGPT has got to fix everything. So I'll throw it in there as well. It's worth the giggle, if nothing else, for a few minutes.
Please do. And every once in a while, John also throws in a couple choice phrases or fun words in the show notes. So you should all go check that out too, just to see where his mind is, because we don't always get to cover everything. But I will try to squeeze in the final two articles. Maybe you mentioned crypto as in cryptocurrency. This is crypto as in cryptography, and Google is working on some quantum safe algorithms and putting them into FIDO2 authenticators, which, talking about hard-coded credentials, we love to see FIDO2 authentication in WebAuthn.
Yeah. I went down a separate rabbit hole for this last week looking at FIDO2, and I don't know if I'd done it before, to be honest. We talk about FIDO2 and YubiKeys and blah, 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 that type of thing. For folks, and maybe I'll throw this one in there as well, to go and take a look at the FIDO2 spec, man, that thing is actually pretty comprehensive of like what needs to be on that FIDO key, how it needs to be secured, 3 or 4 different levels of authentication on there. It's interesting for folks to take a quick glance over and think about, what does FIDO2 mean when you see this on like this little stupid token, which you're pressing to try and get a thing out of it. Technical phrase. In this case here, OpenSK, Mike, is yes it's open on GitHub. Project to really create an authenticator as a research project. They specifically say in here that this is not hardened for side channel attacks. But really, the first quantum safe algorithm to do this, and they actually have links in here. You can get lost in all sorts of things. They've got links to development kits, which have the crypto accelerators in there. They're using something called TalkOS, which is an open source, excuse me, OS for IoT things. Which I really like about it is it's an embedded operating system designed for running multiple concurrent, mutually distrustful applications on low memory and low power microcontrollers. So this one link that we're throwing in here has a bunch of other stuff behind it. So that's a good time waste for all of you who are wasting your time listening to us.
Time well spent, John. Time well spent. But and I think another thing, just a real quick comment or reference I want to put. I threw in an article that I'd written like about 13 years ago from a cross-site scripting vulnerability from about 25 years ago now this week. And it was a cross-site scripting that affected Hotmail. But if you look at, and I have the link in the show notes, to the original disclosure, the original write-up, it has 4 items that the author described about why this is a security concern. And other than using the phrase like Internet Cafe or mentioning Netscape Communicator, I would defy all of our listeners to look at that list of 4 items and try to figure out what decade that is from. So I thought that was just a reminder that maybe we'll have another 25 years of AppSec job security.
I guess we'll have to start doing this in like VR or something, or whatever the kids are doing.
That's right. Now my mind is going to all different places. We'll shorten this from a 30-minute segment into 3-minute TikToks at the most. But that also means that we are getting pretty long on the news. We've got some pre-recorded interviews from Black Hat coming up. But John, anything else that we missed or that you wanted to mention before we close out here?
As always, I take your security very seriously.
Thank you for that. We take all of our listenership very seriously. I take John as seriously as I can. We will be with him for the foreseeable future, and I think that's a good thing. So thank you, everyone. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes, and speaking of taking things seriously, check out Corsica by Turbo Knight. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.